Cosa Nostra members as a whole tend to be rational human beings that function with logic combined with shades of a psychopathic personality that uses charm and violence to get what they want. But there is one line that divides these men while also telling you a lot about them, and that is bringing their sons into the secret society. Some bosses like John Gotti, Carlo Gambino, Joe Bonanno, and Joe Profaci brought their sons into the life, while others like Vincent Mangano and Vincent Giganti kept their boys out of it because they wanted to protect their children. Carmine Persico Jr. was a man that wanted to create a family dynasty within the Mafia. Persico became the boss of what is now called the Colombo family in the mid-1970s while he was in prison. He only enjoyed a few years on the streets as the leader before he was swept up in the Colombo family trial and the Mafia Commission trial in the 1980s. He acted as his own lawyer, much to the horror of the other bosses at the defense table with him. But with the evidence against him and the others so overwhelming, even a high-priced, expensive lawyer with decades of experience had no chance of winning an acquittal. Between both trials, he was sentenced to 139 years in prison. One of the judges called Persico a tragedy because the Colombo family boss was one of the most intelligent people that he had ever met. There was no chance of Persico ever becoming a freeman again, and he was shipped off to the federal prison in Butner, North Carolina, to live out the rest of his days. But despite all this, he refused to relinquish his position as the boss of the Colombo family, and in a few years, his organization would find itself split apart in a new civil war. Little Alley Boy is the nickname for Carmine's son, Alphonse Persico. The little title is there because the name Alley Boy Persico first belonged to his uncle. Carmine wanted his son to run the family as its acting boss while he was away in prison, but there was one problem for that plan. The son had been caught up with his father in the Colombo family trial and was serving a 12-year sentence that began in 1986. This meant that they needed a street boss they could trust in the meantime. To achieve that, the family operations would run smoothly. The Persicos decided that they needed someone who was loyal, and they needed to eliminate anyone who might be seen as subversive. The first choice to be the new leader was the original Alley Boy, but those plans fell through when he skipped bail and became a fugitive to avoid a trial in a case that would put him away for life. A three-man ruling panel was decided as the next best thing, but Carmine soon dissolved it, believing that one man, who was the right man for the job, should be making the decisions instead of a committee. To that end, they bumped up Vic Orena for the position. Born in 1934, Orena had just missed the cutoff of the Appalachian Conference to be inducted into the mob, and he was forced to wait until the 1970s to become a made man. 5 years before his promotion as acting boss, he was a soldier in the crew that Little Alley Boy commanded, and he was bumped up to acting capo after the younger Persico was sent to prison. Pleased with how he ran things, the son recommended the man to his father, and Orena was accepted. It was made clear to Orena when he accepted the promotion that he was just there to keep the seat warm until Little Alley Boy was released from prison. Otherwise, he was given a fair bit of autonomy to ensure things ran smoothly. This included having the discretion of who to accept as official members of the family. Orena's first task as acting boss was to deal with the factions within the family that might have a problem with the Persicos still running things. On orders from Little Alley Boy, Orena had Capo Regime Jimmy Angelino, killed in 1988 because the man was viewed as a threat. Orena ran his activities, and by extension, the family, as a businessman, and he knew that murder was bad for business. So he ordered his killers to dispose of their victims in a way that their bodies would never be found. The Sicilians called this White Death. The arrangement of Orena acting as a steward for the Persicos appeared to work well on the surface, but over time, every kick-up to the bosses that were in prison, combined with their meddling in his decisions on the street while they were thousands of miles away, started to cause resentment. He believed that not only were they out of touch, but their attempt to lead while being absent was hurting the organization more than it was helping. Orena began to grumble to those he knew he could trust that he should be the boss instead of little alley boy, who he viewed as a product of nepotism. The final straw for Orena came when he heard rumors that Persico was trying to negotiate away the rights to his life story. He believed that a media frenzy would lead to a massive law enforcement crackdown that would hurt the guys not in prison. He had had enough and decided to rebel. Since the Persicos were in prison and well-connected, he knew he couldn't have them killed. His strategy was to implement a peaceful takeover by calling a meeting of the family's capos and holding an election. Orena was a smart man, and he believed that he had the support of the majority before even calling the meeting, thanks to many private conversations. The idea was for this takeover to blindside the Persicos and neuter them before they could fight back. But Orena made one huge blunder that snatched away a guaranteed victory. He informed family consigliere Carmine Persico of the plan, and while he smiled and nodded, the man was a Persico loyalist. Persico had been appointed to the position just the year before by Carmine's direct orders. On June 20th, 1991, Orena was driving home that evening when he noticed a car parked in front of his house with 4 men inside. He had a good idea of who they were, and he promptly made a U-turn and sped away. These men were a hit squad assigned by the Persicos, and their job was to kill Orena before he got to his front door. Although no shots ended up being fired that night, this was the start of the Third Colombo War, and it would almost destroy the organization before it concluded. Greg Scarpa was a capo regime in the Colombo family who was first inducted into the organization around 1951. His nickname was the Grim Reaper, as he was known as an efficient and brutal killer, in addition to knowing how to make huge amounts of cash through mafia activities. Unknown to anyone at the time, he was also an FBI informant since the early 1960s during the Profaci Gallo War, using his position as a way to get out of legal troubles. While the attempted Orena hit happened in June, most members of the family, including himself, did not know that war had broken out until the following month. Documented in now declassified FBI files, Scarpa told his handlers that according to Cosa Nostra rules, there were only 3 ways for Persico to be replaced as the boss. The first was that he would have to die. The second would be for him to step down voluntarily. The last would be for the commission to vote and decide his removal. The first option was unlikely due to his age, and he would not actually pass away from natural causes until 2019. The second was not going to happen, as this was what they were fighting for. And the third option was unlikely, since the commission was weary to have meetings, and they would be reluctant to make this choice since all the bosses were convicted in the commission trial. No one wanted to start this precedent with law enforcement's relentless prosecution of the mafia. In addition to that, The Genovese family leadership declared their support of Persico. So the Persico faction had the advantage of legitimacy in Cosa Nostra, but Orena had the majority of the family in his camp. Out of about 130 members, roughly 100 were part of the rebellion, while 30 stayed on as loyalists. Even Salvatore Profaci, the son of the family's founder, Giuseppe, and also a capo with his own crew, threw his support behind Orena. But in the soldiers' department, quality sometimes counts more than quantity, and the man known as the Grim Reaper declared himself to be in the Persico camp. The Persico faction also had the advantage of a better strategic position. All they needed to do was kill Orena and his top lieutenants. Once the leaders of the rebellion were dead, everyone else would fall in line. Carmine Persico would keep the seat warm, and little Ali Boy would be out of prison in a couple of years to retake the throne. Meanwhile, the Orena faction's only strategy they could take was to survive another day. Since they had the numbers, Vic Orena believed that he could win through attrition, destroy Persico's supporters, and then the boss is effectively powerless. And at the same time, maybe they could get lucky and hit him somehow while he was in prison. In October of 1991, a meeting was held between the Orena and Persico factions, with Benny Aloy representing Orena and Teddy Persico representing his imprisoned brother. The meeting was opened by Teddy Persico asking the opposing faction if they still recognized Carmine Persico as the boss of the family. They said they did, but they acknowledged Vic Orena as speaking for the interests of the Colombo family. Teddy then demanded that all of the money Orena collected as acting boss should be transferred to the Persicos, and that Orena should not be acknowledged anymore as the acting boss. The Orena faction refused this, and the meeting was over without a resolution. Also that month, Scarpa informed the FBI that John Gotti has prohibited his family members from contacting or doing business with the Persico loyalists. The Gambino family was supporting the Orena faction. Other families tried to mediate the conflict, but when peace seemed hopeless, they all fell into a policy of neutrality. Patience among the two factions ran out after the October meeting. The first recorded death of this war was associate Jackie Leal, who was killed that month, though his murder might be unrelated to the war and was instead punishment for botching a hit that Vic Orena ordered a couple years earlier on Capo Regime Tommy Osira. Osira was killed because he was pocketing cash that was meant to be kicked up to the boss, and Laele was supposed to make his body disappear. It was discovered, and so it's believed that he was punished for the screw-up with his life. In November, the Orena faction went on the offensive aggressively, trying to eliminate Persico's base of support. Their first target was Greg Scarpa. On November 18th, Scarpa was in Brooklyn, driving home while his daughter and grandson followed behind him. Two cars suddenly cut him off and stopped. Hitmen got out and shot his vehicle as he tried to drive away. He crashed into a few cars and escaped unharmed, while innocent bystanders were injured in the process. Less than a week later, Persico loyalist Hank the Bank Smurra was killed while sitting in his car. The shooter is believed to be William Wild Bill Cutolo. Smurra was one of the men waiting in the car to kill Vic Orena back in June. 4 days later, on November 28th, Carmine Persico's nephew Larry was ambushed on the street. He escaped the assassination and was slightly wounded in the process. Just a week later, on December 5th, Persico loyalist Black Sam Natasa was shot and killed at the Belvidere Social Club. Just 3 days after the Belvidere shooting, the Persico faction hit back against the Orenas in what is probably the most famous murder from this war. Soldier Vinny Fusaro was outside of his house, putting up Christmas decorations when Greg Scarpa shot him from the distance with a high-powered rifle. The Persico faction then attempted to murder Orena associate Joseph Tolino as he was outside of a club. Tolino was shot in the foot, but the friend that he was with, Genovese soldier Gaetano Amato, was killed by accident. The Genovese declined to seek revenge as Amato was warned to stay away from the Colombos since they were at war, but he chose to ignore the decree. The next day, Orena hitmen thought they spotted Persico loyalist Frank Guerra in a bagel shop, and they decided to shoot first and ask questions later. Unfortunately for everyone, they killed 18-year-old Matteo Sperenza, an employee at the shop, in a case of mistaken identity. This murder had the direct effect of amplifying law enforcement's efforts to destroy the family. Greg Scarpa was Carmine Persico's general in the battles on the streets during the Third Colombo War. The November attempt on his life while his daughter and grandson were near enraged the man and turned him into a machine that was obsessed only with revenge. On January 7, 1992, he personally murdered Orena capo Nick Grancio with a shotgun blast, while also wounding Orena associate Anthony Bianco in the process. 1 month later, Scarpa got into a shootout with Orena soldier Joe Waverly Kikase on the street that ended with Kikase taking a .38 caliber slug to the stomach. He ended up surviving. On March 25th, Orena soldier John Minerva and associate Michael Imbergamo were killed while sitting in a car. 2 days later, Persico loyalists Tommy Gioeli and Joe Monteleone were shot. They're seriously wounded but survive. That spring, a new force entered the Third Colombo War. All of these killings were high profile, and with the tips that the FBI were getting in secret from Scarpa, they knew that they needed to take an active part in ending the fighting before more bystanders were killed. Earlier that year, Orena was charged with murder and racketeering, but the FBI had trouble finding him as he was hiding out for his own safety. After receiving a tip, they found him at his girlfriend's new house on Long Island that was still under construction with a small weapons arsenal. He was arrested on April 4th and would never be a free man again. But this did not end the fighting, as Orena's underboss, Joseph Scopo, took on the cause of the Persico rebellion. In April, Orena soldier Louis Maspiso was shot and wounded. 1 month later, Greg Scarpa shot Orena soldier Larry Lampassi to death. In June, the Orena faction struck back and shot at Persico associate Thomas McLaughlin. An innocent bystander named Daniel Norden was hit by one of the bullets. The fighting seemed to cool off for the summer, as there might have been some uncertainty over the future of the Orena faction, since it was becoming clear to everyone that the acting boss was never going to be on the streets again. On August 31st, the Persico faction suffered a major setback when Greg Scarpa was arrested. Scarpa was in very poor health at this point, as he was dying from AIDS, which he contracted during a blood transfusion a few years earlier. While he was killing for Persico on the streets, he was also involved with a civil suit against the hospital that performed the medical procedure. On this day, he was awarded $300,000, but as he was leaving the courtroom, he was arrested on a firearms charge that would turn into a RICO case against him, which also included 3 murders. The prosecutors were unaware that he was an FBI informant, but once the charges were brought, they could not be ignored. Even with their general off the streets and on house arrest pending his trial, the Persico loyalists kept fighting. On October 7th, Orena faction associate Stephen Mancusi was shot and killed. The Orena side retaliated by killing Persico loyalist Vincent de Pippo and his nephew Nail Mastro on October 19th. In December, Persico soldier Richard Capiano was shot and wounded. After that, Orena sympathizer Bobby Tarantola disappeared. On December 28th, Scarpa was woken up in the middle of the night and learned that his son Joe had been threatened by two Lucchese family mobsters, Michael DeRosa and Ronald Moran, over a drug deal that went bad. Scarpa drove with his son to DeRosa's house and shot the man. Moran fired back at them and they ran. Greg Scarpa was hit in the head as he fled, but the bullet missed his brain while destroying one of his eyes. Once authorities learned about what happened, his bail was revoked. In 1993, the war was still officially ongoing, but the law enforcement response was so intense that the fighting between the factions effectively stopped. Federal prosecutor George Stamboulidis had been assigned to take down the Colombo family in 1990 before the war broke out. His strategy was to follow the money. His office focused on accountants that were known to be connected to the mob as money launderers. This paid off big when accountant Kenneth Geller gave them information on Orena's loan sharking rackets and Little Alley Boy's illegal business ventures. Geller had been threatened with his own criminal charges in order to talk, but the prosecutors didn't have to lean too hard, as he had plenty of motivation to turn on the mobsters. He had borrowed more than $1 million from them for an investment that went bad. Now he owed them $11,000 every week just for the interest. He agreed to wear a wire with the promise of receiving witness protection. The warfare also had the effect through the family's rank and file of demoralizing them. Associates and some soldiers began to see that the greedy bosses viewed them as expendable. They began to flip after being arrested on racketeering and murder conspiracy charges. Some even came forward on their own because they feared being killed. In total, 68 capos, soldiers, and associates from both sides were indicted during the war. From the Orena camp, this also included his two sons, Tom Patrizio, who was involved in the construction rackets and made the family a ton of money, plus Dennis Pappas, who was the architect behind the family's money laundering. Persico's brother, Ted, was removed from the streets, along with his cousin and future acting boss, Andy Russo. In addition to these 68 men, 12 more flipped and left Cosa Nostra as informants, while another 12 were killed in the fighting. For a family that had an estimated 130 official members, half were in prison, dead, or gone. This was a decimation. With Orena effectively gone forever and the family in shambles, the war was a Pyrrhic victory for Persico, but it could not be over until the rebel leadership was destroyed. That finally happened on October 20th, 1993, when Orena underboss Joseph Scopo was killed by associates that were hoping to get on the good side of the family's victorious leadership. Carmine Persico continued to rule the family as the official boss until his death in 2019. His cousin Andy Russo ruled as the acting boss in the years after the war before his own trial put him away for a while. Little Alley Boy was back on the streets in 1995 and took over the family as his father planned, with Dad still being the one ultimately in charge. Little Alley Boy would later be sentenced to life in prison in 2009, but he still kept his power as he best could. When his dad died, the family was now free to select a new leader who was not in prison, and they chose Andy Russo, who was now a free man. In September of 2021, Russo was indicted on labor racketeering charges, but he died on April 18, 2022, before his trial could begin. Little Ali Boy's cousin, Teddy Jr., is believed to be the Colombo family boss today. Carmine Persico gained the dynasty that he wanted to create, as his family has dominated the Colombo organization's leadership for 50 years. It came at a price, but they slowly were able to replenish the ranks.